This old guy DIY video has to do with repairing the carburetor on a 2003 Polaris Sportsman 500 HO. So I started this thing yesterday for the first time in 3 years. Gladly it started on the first pull, but it was chugging a little bit, didn't sound right. It was smoking. I could see what, I guess I can't show you down here, but I could see what looked like fuel burning off of the exhaust pipe where it joins the manifold there. And then when I looked beneath the machine, there was fuel on the ground. So I asked myself, where did that fuel come from? And there's a little drain line that runs from the carburetor. I guess I can't really show you in here, but it runs from the carburetor and just exits to the ground. And there was fuel running out of that thing. So I went online to see what the culprit might be, and it said two choices: either you have a failed O-ring in the assembly that mates to the carburetor body that your needle valve sits in, or you have gunk in there that's causing the valve not to seat. So I wasn't sure which one I had. I thought it was probably gunk in the carburetor based on my experience over the years, but gunk was not the problem. I ended up finding a failed O-ring and replacing it with a number 6 O-ring from the local hardware store. And this next 10 minutes I'll show you how I did it. I removed this little plate. I think this thing sits in there just so when you put the carburetor back in place, the thing is level. Now I'm going to take out these two screws for the airbox, and then you have to access this hose clamp from the other side. Then I can pull the airbox out, and I believe I'll be able to get to the carburetor. So I loosened up this little hose clamp, and now it looks like I need to remove the two little hose clamps from these lines that go to the airbox, and then the airbox should be free to go. And these little bolts took the 3/8 inch socket to remove them. When loosening these two little clamps, I found if you just grab the back of the box and pick it up, then you have easy access for your pliers. So when I removed the airbox, you can see that everything is pretty wet in there. And when I first started the machine, I had fuel dripping out down here in the bottom. And I asked myself, where the hell's that fuel coming from? And there's a little line here. This is a drain line that comes off of the overflow tube from the carburetor. Let's see if you can see it in here. It's this little line right there. There's a little, looks like a filter. So anyway, we're headed the right direction. So there's a clamp on a hose on the front of the carburetor that you cannot see very well, but you have to basically stick a long shanked Phillips head screwdriver through there. I'm trying to get the light so you can see the thing. But when you're looking in there, you'll see that there's a little hose clamp you have to get to, so that's what I'm going for now. Now I want to get this snorkel out of here, so to make it easier I removed this bolt and this bolt on this side. Just use a 3/8 inch socket. It should allow me to pull the plastic up enough that I can pull that snorkel out. In addition to the two bolts down here, I needed to take the fuel cap off, and I just grabbed right here. You can see the snorkel's free now. So with that air intake out of the way, I just grabbed the carburetor and wiggled it, and now it's free, with the exception of a couple of cables and the two fuel lines. So I'm going to take the fuel line and the pulse line off, and I'm going to actually do the job right here in the machine. I don't want to mess with the linkages for the choke and the throttle. So after 17 years of living there, the fuel lines did not want to come off, but they're off now. So I'll flip this unit over so I can get to the bottom of the carburetor. So as I tip this thing up, I disconnected that overflow line, and you can see the fuel is running out of there leaking like a sieve. So it looks like we're in the right spot anyway. So my plan now is, with this thing just held in this position, I'm going to remove the screws, take this bottom plate off, and see what we find. Oh, and when I'm doing a job like this, I oftentimes take a rag, like you see that brown rag, I just put it in there to catch whatever happens to fall out of that carburetor that I'm not expecting. So when I initially tried to loosen up these screws, they were just tighter than hell, and I was afraid I was going to strip them. So I put the screwdriver to the end here, and I just wrapped the screwdriver a couple times with a hammer just to provide some shock to that joint, and now they've both turned loose. So when I pulled this assembly off, the bottom is surprisingly clean, so that's encouraging. I'm looking forward to that valve just being hung up. So it looks like I was off with my troubleshooting. When this whole assembly came out, there's nothing frozen up and it all looks good. But as I've seen in some other guys' videos, this little piece right here wiggles like nobody's business. So I suspect the O-ring on this thing failed. I'll need to replace that O-ring and then I can put it back together. So I just pulled this thing out. It was like taking a loose tooth from a kid. Just popped out easily. The orifice isn't plugged, but this thing doesn't show much resistance sitting in the aluminum piece. So I'll go to the book, find out which part number that little O-ring is. I'll get an O-ring and see if we can't put this machine back in action. I pulled the old O-ring off, and when I did, the thing just broke, and it's very dried out. I can feel that. From what I read online, it's the ethanol that gets them. So I measured the diameter of the little piece that the O-ring sits on, and I get 7.6 millimeters. And then online, they're telling me the part number I need is NAPA, part number 7305017. My local NAPA has one for $1.65, so I'm going to run down there and buy one. We'll see if we can put this thing back together. So as I took this float assembly apart, I took this needle valve off, and for a guy with big fingers and not very good dexterity, it's kind of a pain putting it back together. So my assembly aid is this cap from a Bic pen. I just put the valve on that, slide it up through the hole, hook it on, and we're golden. NAPA online gave me the wrong information. They did not have the material in stock. There was a 20-minute drive to the next nearest NAPA store. So I went to Ace Hardware. I got a number 6 O-ring. You see 7/16 OD, 5/16 ID. And it was a whopping 79 cents a piece. And I put the O-ring on the little piece. And when I lay the old dried out O-ring next to it, it looked like a very similar size. So I'm going to take this Ace Hardware 79 cent special, go put it in and see if it works. So I put the number 6 O-ring on, and whenever I'm installing something like this, I just put a little bit of motor oil on my finger. I ran it around the outside of the O-ring so there would be some lubricant, and I press that thing in with my thumb, and right now it's as tight as could be. There won't be any leakage past that thing. Now I'm going to put the float assembly back in place and put the bottom back on just with those 2 screws. So another side effect of the problem that I had with that O-ring being shot is that fuel gets into the engine and it ends up in your oil. So right now I just ran the dipstick in the oil, and where I should be down here, my oil level is all the way up here. So while it's been sitting there for the last 3 years, that fuel has just been running with gravity down into the crankcase. So now that I know what my problem was and I have it apparently fixed, I'll drain and replace the oil before I fire this thing up the next time. So I have the carburetor back together. I'll put the little drain line back on down there. I'll put the thing back in place and put the fuel line on the side and just turn it on and see if it leaks fuel. So I return the fuel line to its location, and I put the pulse line back on, and I opened the fuel valve, and I don't have the leakage like I did before, so now I'm going to try to start it. carburetor's doing its job, so now I'll shut it off and change the oil. When replacing the airbox, I tuck the snorkel in up here. You can see the clamp is loose, and then you have these two bolts. So I just located the bolts over the holes and just tighten them up with the 3/8 inch ratchet. And with these things, since all you're doing is compressing plastic effectively, you know, just take them snug. There's no reason to really crank on them. And now I'll go ahead and tighten up this little guy. As I'm putting this thing back together, you can see the end of this little drain line coming off the carburetor is flared a little bit. There's plenty of length there, so I'm just going to clip the end off, and I'll put this smaller diameter part to the bottom of the carburetor so it'll stay there. So I have this thing buttoned back together. It starts where I thought I was going to have a problem with the gunk in the carburetor. In fact, it was the alcohol from ethanol probably dried out that O-ring, so I replaced that O-ring with a number 6 O-ring from the hardware store. Preliminary result is no leakage, so I'll wind this one up and watch for my videos on changing oil and changing the spark plug. Have a nice day.